So I'm going to say Her Story, Return of the Obra Dinn, and Heaven's Vault are all information games. And to be an information game, the game itself has to be, like what you do in the game has to be finding out information from other information. And the difference between that and like, you know, you can make a point-and-click adventure game where thematically what you're doing is trying to find out, like, solve a murder, like find out some information like that. But if the way you do that is to use items in your inventory on things in the world, and what you're really doing is just kind of guessing what the solution is that the designer intended to the puzzle, that's not an information game. And equally, like, most puzzle games kind of, you could say that they're about information in some way, but really you're learning some logical rules and following them in a very rigid way, like within the parameters of this little logic game. How do you solve this? Whereas something like Her Story, you're trying to solve a murder, and there are no strict rules as to how you do it, and there are strict rules as to what information you'll be supplied with, but your leaps of logic can follow whatever makes sense to you. And the unique thing about Her Story in this set of three games, is that it doesn't check your answers. It has no way of verifying whether you figured it out or not, and it's just whether you're happy that you figured it out. You could try and find every single clip, but that's kind of more of a technical word searchy game and not about finding information. And the cool thing about information games is, in theory, like, your goal is the information. You just want to you just want to know the thing. And that's amazing, because that's kind of unlike anything else. Like Her Story, if you were spoiled on Her Story, there's almost no point in playing it. You almost couldn't play it. Like, how would you play it? Because all you're trying to do in the game is find out the answers. Obra Dinn is kind of the midpoint where it's still a very kind of, I always think of it as like human information. You're trying to reason about people, and you're allowed to use anything that you would use in real life trying to reason about these people. The game even tells you, like, if you see a bunch of people who kind of tend to hang out together in a certain portrait or something, you can assume they probably all have the same job, or they all they might be from the same country, or they might know each other. And that kind of thing is not codified into the game. It's just the story is, in theory, makes sense, and you are allowed to make leaps of logic that make sense of it. But Obra Dinn checks your answers, because there is an absolute truth. You're trying to figure out who everybody is in a picture, or other. How do you actually fill in your information? It's names and fates, but you do have to match them up to the picture, don't you? You have to know who is in the picture. Yeah. And so it's checking all of those things. Have you got their appearance, their name, and their fate all linked to each other? And its method for doing that is, once you've got 3 right, it'll tell you, hey, these 3 are right. And that could be you've only guessed 3 and you got all 3 of them right, or it could be you guessed 10 and only 3 of your guesses are right. But it's a good way of non-directly verifying your stuff. Then Heaven's Vault is actually primarily a sort of, well, it's an adventure game where it's kind of a point-and-click adventure game with a lot of dialogue and walking around and investigating things, which is all very traditional and not an information game. But what you actually find in the world is largely inscriptions. It's ancient lettering, and this lettering is in a language that nobody else speaks anymore, and you have to decipher it almost from first principles, with a lot of help from the game's interface and some assumptions the game makes. And for the purposes of this, I'm going to kind of forget about everything else in Heaven's Vault. It's just about the language game. The language game is an information game because your goal, really my goal when I'm playing Heaven's Vault, is just to learn the language. I just want to understand this language. I want to be able to read it well. And when you show me a new inscription, a new chunk of text, my goal is to read it, and that's an end in itself. I'm never thinking like, oh, if I can understand this, I'll be able to solve the game and progress to the next puzzle. Because actually the game its progression logic is weird, and it will just kind of push you forwards no matter what, really. You don't need to do anything. And so, a bit like Her Story, you're kind of going at it for your own reasons. You kind of just want to understand it just to understand it. But it has a different relationship with verifying your input. So it does at times tell you, you're right about this, this is correct. But what's weird about it is that its system for doing that is not very... In Obra Dinn, if you knew the answers, if you were just right about everything, the game would just tell you, oh yeah, you're right, oh yeah, you're right about that, yep, you're right about that, okay, you just solved all 50 fates, you're right. Obviously the game is balanced in a way that it would be impossible to do that from in any short space of time. But Heaven's Vault, you can be right and you can be certain and it won't tell you. It's about how many times you got it right in different places, and so that's kind of a source of frustration at times, in that there are words, especially when you've learned a word. Heaven's Vault, the thing that's cool about it is that you're not just looking at symbols and trying to match them to words. The words of the language are made up of glyphs, and the glyphs have individual meaning, and you're never really told those. There are a couple of cases where the glyph, it can be a word in itself, and therefore you do get a verification of your interpretation of that. So like the word for is, for example, that's just one glyph and you'll get told what it is. When you guess it right and use it in a couple of different sentences, you'll be told it's right. But the rest of the time, the verification you get is what the word means, but what you're really thinking about and reasoning about in your head is what the glyphs mean. And again, you're never told that specifically. And so probably like 90% of the glyphs I know, I've never been told what they mean for sure. I've just had verification of the words they're in. And so I know, like, I guess there are quite a lot of them you do get on their own, but there are a bunch of glyphs where I know for sure what they mean, but I've never been told and the game's never verified it. And yeah, so the ones that are frustrating are when, like, you know this word, like for example, if you know the glyph for life, and then you also know the glyph for not, and then you have a word that's just not life, you know it's death. You know that means death, but you can't, you'll be offered death as one of the three options for like what this word could mean. You can put it in there and great, you'll be able to understand the text, but the game won't sort of check it off as like, yes, you've solved this, until you've used it in several different places. And whether or not you can do that is dependent on what you find, and that's the problem, is that it's not up to you what you find. You might never find something else with the word death in it, and therefore you're never allowed to be sure of that thing, even though you are sure, you know, you understand the logic of this language and you figured it out. So that's like a case where your self-motivated understanding, if this was her story and there was no verification of what you're doing, I would be happy. I would be like, oh, it's not life, that means death. And now using that knowledge, I've made sense of the sentence. Awesome, I'm having a great time. But because there is a way for it to be verified and it's not giving me that, it undoes the inherent satisfaction of solving the puzzle, of understanding the information, of gaining the information. And so verification is the tricky thing in these games. If her story doesn't do it and it works for her story, I think it would be difficult. Obra Dinn couldn't really work like that. And in fact, the reason that Heaven's Vault and Obra Dinn have verification processes is that you need some of the information to be confirmed to make leaps of logic about the next piece of information. If you never got confirmed who anybody was in Obra Dinn, even if you were pretty sure of a bunch of them, it would become impossible to kind of keep it straight. It's like, so much of it is a process of elimination. It's just like, well, it can't be that guy because that guy's definitely this guy, and therefore it must be this one. And Heaven's Vault, a bit less so, but it's still, to understand a sentence of 5 words, if you know 4 of them, understanding the 5th one is easy, or much easier. If you were never told for sure if your answers are right, it would be very derailing if some of your answers are wrong. And so when the game comes in and says, no, these 3 are definitely right, I'm telling you, you got that right. These other 2, one of them, you've guessed it and we haven't verified it yet. That doesn't mean it's wrong, we just haven't verified it yet. And the 4th one you don't know at all, take a guess now. That works, but if they're all question marks, like any of these could be wrong, it gets harder. You can get lost in the weeds. So, thinking about all this, because it seems like there's room for more games like this, and they're really cool for a whole bunch of reasons. One is, they have the feel of solving a puzzle in a much truer sense than puzzle games. Puzzle games are like, well, pretend the world works like this, pretend these are the rules of the world, now use those rules to arrive at the solution in the way that we've intended. Whereas this says, you know, the rules of this world are just the rules it would naturally have, and use anything in your brain, use your whole brain to figure this out. Like, it feels like it draws on a different kind of intelligence than rigorously logical puzzle solving does. And it still is logic and it still is deduction. But it's a different kind of deduction. Working within a logical framework, it's almost like maths or sort of game theory or logic games. This comes up, I did maths and philosophy, so there's a lot of like particular examples of things like that, where you just get a set of rules and everything that you're presented with makes sense within these rules, and you apply those rules in a certain way. And this is not that. This is much more kind of big brain thinking, and it's cool. It makes me optimistic that these games would appeal to a broader audience than, you know, more traditional puzzle games, or at least a different audience. And you know, they've been very successful. Like Her Story and Obra Dinn have been very successful. I think Heaven's Vault, I can't say for sure, but it doesn't seem like from the number of Steam reviews that it's been a huge hit. But that's not. I wish it was just the language game, or I wish it was the language game in a really traditional, simple framework, because the language game is just brilliant. It's so good. And it just, even despite the flaw I mentioned earlier, that's pretty small in the grand scheme of things. Flaws of Heaven's Vault, if I gave you a list of the top 15, nothing about the language game would be in it. It would be all about stuff surrounding it, because they do a whole load of stuff in really weird ways, and it just gets in the way of getting to the language stuff. I am pretty convinced that if you did Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, but replaced all of the point-and-click inventory puzzles with the language game from Heaven's Vault, that would be my favourite adventure game of all time. Now I'm playing Phantom Doctrine, and that's definitely not an information game in general. At least, well, it's probably too early to say because I'm only a few missions in, but it does have a little information minigame in it, which is a red string board. So if you've seen like cork boards in like detective shows or conspiracy thrillers where photos and stuff are pinned on it and then connected with red string to show the connections, it has one of those, and it does a good job of just giving that enough. It's interactive, and you get to place those things and connect those things, and it gives you just enough structure and just enough confirmation that's fun but not overwhelming or daunting. And I don't think it's an information game because you're not really doing any of it by reasoning. You're just looking. When you open up a bit of intel, it'll be a mostly redacted document with black bars, and just a few snippets of text that are just kind of, they do a good job of being like intriguing without spelling everything out. Well, there's certainly nowhere near spelling anything out. I have no idea what's going on. But all you're trying to do is just look for keywords. So if it's something sounds like it's somebody's code name or the name of a place or an organization, you just click on it, and that just, all that does is tag it with that name, and then when you go back to the corkboard, those names that you tagged are attached to this document. And creating links between things, you don't have to do any big brain reasoning. You just, if this one mentions Brinkman and this one mentions Brinkman, you just draw a line between them, and the word Brinkman even like fades out, saying, okay, you've got it now, that's the connection you need to look for, there's nothing more. And it feels really good. It just, I think actually now that I spell it out, you know, like the game side of it is so basic and doesn't require you to engage with the information at all, really, beyond clicking on words. That makes it all the more impressive how good it feels to do this. Like, because you also, it's just like, it's such a rich like field for game stuff, because you link these things, and as you make more of these connections, your board becomes a mess because of things you didn't know. Like when you laid it out, I mean, you don't actually lay it out necessarily yourself in the first place, they get kind of placed automatically. And that placement tends to be bad. It tends to be like, oh, this thing is actually connected to 3 things over here, and in between that field all those lines are going across, these things are connected to each other, but they're not connected to that, and it's really unclear because this thing's going over there. But you can pick these things up and drag them, and of course the connections all move with them. So you shuffle them around until, okay, these things that are all connected over here go there, and then I'm still really early on, but I've already got to the point where I'm like, oh, this is a whole network over here, and I need to move all this to the top of my board, and all these other little sub-networks go down to the bottom of the board, and they're not connected to that yet, but maybe they will be one day. And I think the last mission I did, I got a connection that was like, these two sub-networks I found the bridge between them, and it's this. And all of that is fun, even without me understanding a damn thing about what's going on. And the snippets are like so small and so vague. But it's immediately exciting. It's like, oh my god, I really want to figure this out. And I want to engage with it more than I am. I want to be engaging with the narrative side of it. I want to be making these leaps of logic from what I've reasoned is right. And so if you can make an information game that was like that, where you are reading the information on these cards, like the individual nodes on the corkboard, and clicking on code names works really well. It's kind of like a note to self, but perhaps like simply clicking on them is maybe too basic. Okay, I should say, this is if you're going to make a whole game just about this. This is not what Phantom Doctrine should have done, because Phantom Doctrine is plenty complicated already. But if you're making a game just about the corkboard, with maybe like some simple adventure game stuff tacked onto it, I want to be reading these snippets and then using my own narrative reasoning to decide, is this about Brinkman? Like, it doesn't say Brinkman. Like, obviously early on you lead people in with like some basic stuff where it just says Brinkman, click on it. And then later on it's like, okay, they're talking about a Czech operative who is a forger and this and this and this. What do we know about Brinkman? Well, they are Czech, but we don't know anything else about, you know, their skill set or whatever. And then as you learn more, you're getting to the point where you're like, oh shit, no, now we know enough to say that's not Brinkman, that's someone else. It can't be, because Brinkman is not a forger or something like that. And you would need a way to write that down in game. Obviously, like note-taking, this is a good sign of an information game. Is if you're finding yourself taking a lot of paper notes when playing a game, then it's probably an information game. You'll be doing that, I think, but you would need, I would want you to be able to put your theory into the game itself, so that when you zoom out to the corkboard, you are seeing those little tags of code names and key links. Basically, I think the cool thing that Phantom Doctrine does that I'd want to build on is that it says, it defines what a red string is. Like a red string, in theory, is just a connection between these two things, and it's pretty vague what it could mean. It could mean this person killed that person, it could mean this person is that person. There's all these different relationships that could have different things. And the cool thing about Phantom Doctrine, or the useful contribution it makes to this potential genre, is to say, it's just, does this thing mention this thing, and does the thing mention that thing? And that makes it simple enough that you could then go deeper on, like, well, let's look into why you would think this mentions somebody. If it literally mentions them, that's easy. And then the more complicated cases, it's alluding to them, but you have to do some reasoning to figure out if that is who it is. And like all of these games, you should be able to put in a theory with a question mark on it. And actually something none of them have is a way to indicate you're sure. The game can tell you you're right, and you can put in a theory, but in Oberdin and in Heaven's Vault, I'm often in a situation, both those games involve me sometimes having just a wild guess, and sometimes having something I'm 95% sure of, I'm really sure of it. And it would be very useful later on, because, as I say, both games, the reason they have any verification at all is that you are often making narrative leaps, logical leaps, based on what information you already have in the system, and often that information is not verified yet, and that doesn't mean it's wrong, it just means it isn't verified yet. And it's hard to remember. When I said this was Brinkman, was I guessing, or did I actually have a good reason to believe that? And so I would love it. Actually, yeah, here's how you should do it. It would just be pencil or pen. So if you don't know, like when you write in something, you just kind of first click on the pencil or click on the pen, and if it's pencil, then it's something you're just thinking, oh, maybe Brinkman? And if it's pen, it's like, oh, this is Brinkman, and the game doesn't verify it yet. I think the verification I was thinking of, I don't know about Oberdin, but for Heaven's Vault, so Oberdin's verification actually, I'll get back into a problem with it in a minute, but Heaven's Vault, one way you can sort of get more verification is you go and see your friend Huang, and he will tell you oh yes, I'm sure you're right about this word. Like, oh, I've also found something with an inscription like this, and through doing that you get confirmation on what you've got. They limit you. Every time you visit him you can do 3 of those things, and he'll help you out with them. And Obra Dinn, like I say, doesn't verify you until you've got 3 right. You do need to limit the rate at which the player can check their work against the game, which they can get verification, because if you don't, then you can just try every possibility. And these games really work best when there's a limited number of possibilities, and that's a situation where guessing is too viable if you give them verification. And that's maybe another definition of an information game, is that the possibilities need to be few enough that it's not creative writing, you're not making stuff up. It's got to be one of these options, but many enough that guesswork by itself would never work. Like if you couldn't guess thing 1 and then thing 2 and then thing 3 and have a 1 in and have more than a 50% chance of being right. It needs to be enough of a complicated mess that just doing that would never get you anywhere. So Obra Dinn's verification system is good, but it's exploitable, and it's hard not to exploit it, really, or it's telling you something more than what it intends to. What it wants to do is, I think, its stated intent anyway, is to tell you these 3 things are right. You got 3 things right. But if you filled in more than 3 fates since you last had that verification, if you filled in your 4th fate and it tells you, oh yeah, these 3 are right, whoops, that 4th one, now you know for sure is wrong. It cannot be right. Because if it was right, you would have been told 1 fate ago, right? And so the inevitable exploit, the one you can't help doing really, is every time you're told some stuff is right, anything you've completely filled in, you now know something's wrong about it. And so you go through those things and you think, okay, well, one of these things, am I wrong about their identity or their fate or whatever? And then I found myself intentionally exploiting it, where I would, before I filled in one I knew was right, I would go in and, or if I had 2 I was pretty sure of, I would just pencil in some other stuff, and then if it doesn't trigger, I know they're wrong. I basically just penciled in a lot of stuff. I just filled in a lot of fates that I wasn't very sure of. If it came down to like, it's either this guy or that guy, I just put in one of them and then move on, find some more stuff I am sure of, fill those in, and then either I get it in 2 fates time and I was right with that first guess, or I get it in 3 fates time and I was wrong with that first guess. And either way I figured it out for sure. And you're in that situation so much that it was exploiting that still felt like playing the game, weirdly. I'm usually one who's good at controlling how I play to keep it fun. But I felt clever doing that. I was like, I figured out this rule, so I'm going to use it. But in doing that, I wasn't engaging with the narrative. The bigger problem with Obra Dinn, actually, for me, was just that kind of guesswork. There are several kinds of bad kinds of guesswork in Obra Dinn that you can do that work. One is racial stereotyping. There's a bunch of things where you can just say, oh, this guy looks like he's from there, and so I'll fill that in. And that's probably not a good thing. It's not a good way for a game to work. It does work because the game follows those stereotypes, and I don't even necessarily think it shouldn't follow those stereotypes, because if it doesn't, it becomes nightmarish. It's like it's giving you misleading information, and the game is such a complex mess of hints and suggestions that fucking you in that way would be really derailing, unless you structured the whole game to make that point. But if you did that, I think you'd have to strip away a load of other complexity to make that effective, otherwise it's just baffling. And the game's defense, I think, for that is that you don't have to racially stereotype, and you don't have to guess and exploit the system. All these bad ways of guessing, if you investigated enough, you would find concrete information. And I want to do that. I want to be that guy. I want to get the real hard information, not jump to conclusions. But then the problem becomes the interface for doing that is just a fucking pain in the ass. It's just having to physically walk around the ship and study things and get into these different memories in different time periods. Don't get me wrong, it's a tough challenge. I don't know how you structure it in a really slick way, but certainly the way it's done just makes it very hard to get from one memory to the next. Like, oh, I know this, I want to check, who's this guy, who's the other guy at the poker table in that other memory? Oh, I've got to fucking look it up in the journal, find out where it was on the ship, walk to that corpse, jump into that corpse, maybe it was in another different corpse, and then walk to the place within that memory and then look at it, and that can be like 7 minutes of work, and then you're like, oh no, it wasn't. Well, time to check one of the other 30 possibilities for ways of solving this. And it's just, there's so much you would need to do. So many of the clues are so subtle, and I want to engage with that stuff, I want to be jumping into it, but it's such a fucking pain in the ass to actually just do the legwork of investigating that. If it was my job, I would be happy to do that. If I was literally a detective or an insurance claims investigator and I was being paid to do that, then doing the legwork would be like a necessary evil, and it would be still a little bit tedious, but having a greater purpose, you know, would make it worthwhile. But as a game, you kind of just want to get that out the way and make it. The problem is not that it's unpleasant and that you do that and then the game is worth 7 out of 10 instead of 8 out of 10. It's that you don't do it. It's that, oh, that's a fucking pain in the ass, so I'm not going to do it. I'm going to use this cheap kind of guesswork. And in a game that's naturally susceptible to that kind of cheap guesswork, I think the burden on the creator to do even more to make it convenient to do it the good way is higher. It's really important to make sure that doing things the good way, engaging with the detail and being fastidious and rigorous and attentive, make those things fun. Let me get to the part where I am studying someone's face or looking at the label on their hammock or peering over their shoulder and doing the reasoning, because that itself is time consuming and a little bit slow. And if there's also a shitload of legwork and just getting past the interface, just getting through how the game is structured to get to that stuff, then that's a pain in the ass. But the corkboard, it's used in detective stuff, but in Phantom Doctrine is a spy thriller. It's like a kind of a global conspiracy / espionage / political thing, and it's a good fit for that. And I think making an information game that's entirely about that suits it well, because the aesthetic of that kind of fantasy is an overwhelming amount of information. If I wanted to write a spy thriller as a movie, I would just be throwing code words at you and place names at you and references to things that you never find out. This information overload is part of the aesthetic. It makes it feel like a spy thriller when you have all these information and code names that you don't understand yet. And the information game wants to have that much information. All of them like flood you with leads and possibilities and ideas and clues and keywords that don't make sense yet, and the promise of them and the excitement of them is that you will make sense of them eventually. And actually, now that I say it, this is not only does that make it a good fit for an espionage thriller, but I think it's the best way to do an espionage thriller. I think well, to be more specific, I think it's a better way to do an espionage thriller than a movie is. Like, that sense of all this stuff rushing past you and not being fully understood is cool, and it gives it a vibe, and it's part of the excitement. But in a movie, you never do find out what they are. Like, there just isn't enough time. I'm sure the creator understands what they all are, but they don't have time to explain it to you. And even in a novel, I think you get a lot more information, a lot more detail and background and stuff, but it's going to be hard to hold it in your head if you're reading in kind of short bursts over the course of a thing. Whereas games, you also might play in short bursts over a long period of time and forget things, but I think games are uniquely situated to let you store information and present it back to you when you next play. And I mean, if you wanted to keep track of a really complex spy thriller novel that you're reading that was 100,000 words long, and you're reading over the course of 2 months, you might make a corkboard with little like pictures and code names and connections. Like, this interface is the way you remember and keep track of things. That's literally why it exists in the real world. I mean, it's loosely based on things people with investigative jobs actually use. And so if that was the game, your mnemonic device is already in there, it just is the game. And I love the idea that you could be hearing all these code names and references to like what happened in Cuba in 1971 and all this other stuff, and eventually get to the bottom of it. Like at first it's just the aesthetic and it's making it exciting and intriguing, and then it becomes the gameplay and you actually start to connect it all together. And I think the corkboard, so as you're making these connections, I think at some point you want to kind of put something to bed, right? That's the nice thing about Obra Dinn, is that when it verifies those things, it kind of takes them off your plate. Like, you're done with that now, you don't have to worry about who that is, plus that gives you just some leaping off points to reason about the other stuff. And so you'd need that as well. It would have to be more than just like one giant massive spider's web. It would have to be... Phantom Doctrine has sub-boards, so it's actually, I just have access to 2 corkboards at the moment. It's kind of weird because I can't connect things that are on each of them. Like, I can't connect anything from board A to anything on board B, even though the keywords, there are some keywords in common. And so there's some stuff on board A where like, there's only one mention of, I'll say Brinkman again. And on board B there's a mention of Brinkman, but I can't connect board A to board B, and there's nothing within the boards that do it. I know eventually there will be, because it's a designed thing where I'm going to get enough information to reason about this, but it feels weird right now that I know these bits of information, these must be connected, but I don't know, I can't make that connection because they're on separate boards. So you'd have to structure it in quite a specific way, where like, I'm kind of thinking of like SD6 in Alias. So there's a great scene in Alias, it's kind of, it sets the scope for the whole series, where Sydney, this agent who's been infiltrating this clandestine organisation who pretend to be the CIA but they're not, she's ready to take them down. She's like, look, I got your information, let's raid them now. And her handler shows her a map like, here's SD6, and then here's all the massive like spider's web it's part of, and it goes into this much bigger thing, and it's just one of like 17 similar organizations, and they'll feed into these higher level organizations. I think that's what you want. I think you want like aboard this SD6, and you solve that like 3 hours into the game, or 2 hours into the game, or maybe 1. And however the verification system works, you get verification on it. It's like, that is, okay, you're right about SD6, we filled that in. And now that becomes one node on like a meta board, where all of your corkboards are themselves stapled to a larger corkboard. It's like the size of a house. And you put red ropes between them. You have to climb up the ropes to push the new thing. It becomes a grappling hook game where you have to scale the size of your enormous meta corkboard. No, that's probably not how you present it. But that kind of progress would be cool, right? If you solve the mini spider's web, you get to progress to the bigger spider's web, and then within that, obviously, it's not just everything else, every other node on that is already figured out, it's every other node on that as well. Okay, now there's SD5, we don't know anything about them, so we can't connect them to anything yet, but delve into it, and here's our leads. The thing that's cool about Phantom Doctrine, I've probably said that phrase like 7 times, another thing that's cool about Phantom Doctrine and the way it handles it is that the intel pieces you're getting for this corkboard are things you find in the mission. So when I do a mission and I see these optional collectibles, like there's a document over there, there's a document over there, I don't know, even in XCOM where they tie into the resource system, I'm just like, alright, I'll do it if I have time, I guess. But here I'm like, we are getting those 2 fucking documents, because that could link Brinkman to anything. Like, even though it's, again, I'm not engaging in the narrative, I don't know what any of this stuff means, it means nothing to me yet, and I'm making these connections that are just game mechanics that don't mean anything to me yet. I'm still like, oh my god, we have to get that document, because that might make sense of this whole thing, it might blow the case wide open. And so it's a cool game in itself, the corkboard stuff, but it also like cries out to be tying into something else. If there's any way that you can be, you know, optionally fetching these documents. In the case of Phantom Doctrine, they made a whole fucking XCOM game to bolt onto that with its own meta layer, you know, globe map thing. And it already feels very complicated, and I'm not looking forward to getting more complicated. But going deeper on the corkboard stuff and having a simpler game attached to it with optional objectives to get these kinds of documents would, I think, be super compelling.